So today I want to talk about Vaughan Williams. Now, Vaughan Williams was one of the most important composers of the early 20th century and completely changed the state of British music at the time. So Ralph Vaughan Williams was born in 1872 and died in 1958, and he was born in a place called Gloucester in England, which is right here. It's also worth noting that Williams' father was a vicar, which is extremely important when we come to talk about his influences. Now, because of his upbringing, he was influenced quite a lot by the English choral tradition, notably the Tudor church music of composers such as William Byrd. It's worth noting that Williams did not enjoy church, and even from a young age showed atheistic beliefs. However, he did enjoy the choral music that was sung. The modal tonality of choral music is something that affected his next biggest taste, which was English folk music. Williams was extremely interested in English folk music, especially in his early adulthood. Together with a group of other musicians, he actually catalogued quite a lot of folk music. He'd go up to them and be like,
"Hey, can I put loads of dots on paper while you're playing for no real reason?"
and they'd be like,
Sure.
Now, it's important to note that all of this English folk music was passed down from generation to generation completely binaurally with no sheet music. Another big influence was that modal harmony, which is something we will get onto very shortly. And the use of modes in his work carries over from the English choral tradition, which he borrowed from Tudor church music. Now, music at the time was very German and very romantic, which Williams didn't really have much of an interest in. So Williams decided to move to France to study under Ravel and Debussy and learn about the Impressionist movement in France. Williams employs a lot of these techniques in his work, from things like tremolo strings to parallel harmony, which we will get onto, and eased British people into the Impressionist sound. In this video, we're going to talk about On Wenlock Edge, which is what's called a song cycle. Instead of having one piece with multiple movements, instead you'd have multiple pieces that are to be listened to together. And we're going to look at the first, third, and fifth songs from the cycle. Now, the setting of these songs and the lyrics are taken from a group of poems called A Shropshire Lad. Now, before we continue, it's really important you listen to the whole song cycle of On Wenlock Edge. Even though we're only looking at songs 1, 3, and 5, listening to the whole piece will give you a better idea of the sound. Also, you'll have no idea what I'm talking about otherwise. In this video, we're going to be looking at the instrumentation, rhythm and meter, texture, harmony, and structure. So starting with instrumentation, it's worth noting that the instrumentation is unusual. Now, a piano quintet isn't unusual for the late 19th century, with composers such as Schumann and Brahms using it. However, the combination of solo voice and piano quintet is extremely rare. It's that rare that Williams actually supplied an alternative piano score to be used only if there was no string quartet available. Also, you can notice that the left hand of the piano is almost always doubling the cello part. Now, the piano regularly uses what's called block chords, which is a homophonic style used to create larger chords underneath the melody line. You can hear this quite a lot in the last song, and it's used to illustrate the sound of church bells. Poetry in A Shropshire Lad makes frequent reference to bells and churches, and Vaughan Williams uses these block chords as a motif for bells, which he uses later on. Another technique he uses is called a trill, and a trill is an ornament used to alter between two close notes. Now, writing it is quite difficult, so it's often used as a TR with a line and sounds like this. And you can hear it in bar 33 of the first song. Williams also uses something called parallel chords, which are a sequence of chords consisting of intervals that do not change as the chord changes. You can hear that in bar 2, and they're all first inversions and in intervals of minor thirds. Now, do you know what the left-hand piano pedal does?
Do you?
Now, it's called the soft pedal or the una corda. Now, una corda means one string in Italian and is used to soften the whole sound of the piano significantly. Now, the piano keys are attached to hammers, which in turn hit the strings and give us the piano sound. Now, the una corda actually shifts the hammers on the piano, so instead of hitting all the strings, they hit less of the strings. Una corda is used right at the beginning of Is My Team Ploughing, and because it's pianissimo, it can barely be heard. But in bar 9 we see what's called tricorda, meaning 3 strings, which is to release. Now, the piano also uses very rapid, fast arpeggios, which are as a chord broken into a sequence of notes. We can hear it in bar 31 of the first track. Now we move on to strings. Now we can see tremolo strings right from the beginning that's used in combination with pizzicato cello. Now pizzicato is a technique used on string instruments where you pluck the strings with your fingers instead of a bow. Also in this section we can see that the cello is playing in the tenor clef instead of the bass clef. This clef is often used by cellists as it makes higher register parts easier to read. Also, interestingly, on bar 8, we can see the cello playing what's called a triple stop, which is when you're playing 3 strings on the cello at the same time. Williams also uses a string technique called sol ponticello. Sol ponticello requires the string player to play very close to the bridge, giving a more harsh tonality. Instead of sounding like this, it sounds like this. This becomes increasingly interesting when you look at the lyrics shortly afterward. While the instruments are playing a very harsh sound, you also have reference to a gale, which is a type of wind. Now this is what's called word painting. Now word painting is a technique used when the music literally describes the lyrics or vice versa. A good example of this is Despacito. Despacito translates as slowly in Spanish, and in the song, whenever Despacito is said, the whole song slows down. Now this very same technique is used in bar 57. The line, "The gale, it plies the saplings double," uses sol ponticello to reference the sound of the wind or the gale. Now there's multiple parts of the pieces where the instrumentation reduces to just the cello, the pianist and the vocalist. Another technique used is called con sordino, which means muted, and requires a mute on the string itself. And it changes the sound of the violin from this to this. This muted sound can be heard right at the end of Is My Team Ploughing. We also see the pizzicato technique being used in the violin, in addition to arco being used in the other strings. This technique is used to sound like bells, to go with the motif used earlier. This use of bells is another example of word painting, as the lyrics itself make explicit mention to the use of bells in a church. We also have open harmonics, which can be seen right at the end of Bread Hill. The marking used for this is a small circle above the note head. This technique requires the player to perform softly halfway down the string to give a different tonality, which ends up sounding more like woodwind than string, and gives us that bell sound again. Moving on to the vocal style, we can see that most of the parts seem to sit safely in the standard tenor range, except at the end of End My Team Ploughing with some occasional high notes. The two vocal dictation techniques used are syllabic and melismatic. Syllabic meaning one note per syllable, like so. I am the very model of a modern major general, life information, vegetable, animal and mineral. We can see that most of the piece is syllabic in nature. The other technique used is melismatic, which is when you use multiple notes per syllable, like so. And occurs multiple times in the song cycle. One of the more notable attributes of the vocal part is actually how masterfully this has been translated from poetry to lyrics. Williams uses multiple techniques to actually maintain the accentation of a lot of the piece, such as the use of an anacrusis to fit the iambic nature of the poetry, and to make sure that the stress and accents landed at the same time as the music. And finally, at the beginning of Is My Team Ploughing, the solo tenor is actually instructed to sing in a totally free tempo, as long as it finishes before the instrumental. Now moving on to the melodic style of the piece, we can see that the modal style of the folk song influenced melodic writing is immediately apparent in the first song. The opening vocal line has a very restricted note range of only 4 letter name pitches, before the F on the word reckon introduces a 5th note, a type of pentatonic outline. Then the style changes dramatically after the forte climax on the top G of bar 13, as the voice descends chromatically down to an E flat. This sudden change adds to the drama of the storm mentioned in the lyrics. All these features are repeated, of course, in the second verse. Now, in the second track, we can clearly see what is a D to D Dorian, with a flat third and a flat seventh. Now, for the melody, the intervals between the notes don't seem to go one way or the other, with frequent use of conjunct and disjunct melody. We can see more conjunct melody used right at the beginning of the first piece, and we can see that this conjunct style seems to maintain across most pieces. However, there is quite frequent use of more disjunct melody, for example in bars 14 to 15, where there are more larger disjunct leaps. Now, there are many points in the tracks where the vocals actually change whether we believe something is modal or not. The beginning of Bread and Hill indicates G major, but the flattened seventh that is introduced in the vocals makes us think it's actually G to G mixolydian, due to this F natural at bar 29, which would make this the flat seventh of a G to G mixolydian, which would indicate a more modal tonality to the track. This then moves to some more chromatic movement used near the middle of the song. Now we will move on to rhythm and meter. Now, a frequent use of triplets is very common amongst Williams' work, which is 3 notes in the place of 1 crotchet. But he also uses sextuplets, which is 6 notes in the space of a crotchet, like so. And at bar 3, we see what's called a cross rhythm between the sextuplet semiquavers and the semiquavers in the left hand. Now at bar 31, we see some very fast rhythms. Faster than quavers, faster than semiquavers, faster than demi-semiquavers, we have hemi-demi-semiquavers. You can see these being used in the form of arpeggios in the right and left hand in the piano, and it's worth noting that these are extremely difficult to play. Williams often uses very quick time signature changes, often changing from 3/4 to 4/4 and 2/4 in quick succession. He also uses tempo markings such as animando to indicate speed changes. Furthermore, he uses very long sustained notes with tied semibreves in the beginning of Bread and Hill. One of the most important rhythmic features of the 3 songs is the careful attention Vaughan Williams gives to the accentation of syllables and an attempt to reach as close as possible to the natural rhythms of speech. It would be entirely possible to speak the words at the beginning of the first song using Vaughan Williams' rhythm, and it would sound perfectly natural. Now we move on to texture, and it's worth noting that Vaughan Williams constantly changes and varies the texture in his pieces. At the beginning of the first song, there are what's called parallel first inversions. These are a series of parallel first inversion triads that are prolonging the harmony and transitioning between the harmonic functions. Also, the piano doubles the upper string parts here, while the pizzicato cello plays notes doubling the second violin down an octave. From bar 7, there's ostinato sextuplets in the right hand, unison trills in the violin and viola, and the cello and piano left hand double the voice part 2 octaves below. From bar 50, the strings drop out, leaving just the voice and piano, and the cello joins with a chromatic descent. The song then ends with the piano on its own, unaccompanied. Then at the beginning of Is My Team Ploughing, all the instrument parts move together in what's called a homorhythm, which is where they all move together at the same rhythm. When this moves on, this chordal homophony enables the voice to sing free in tempo while they're playing the same rhythm. This allows the voice to sing free in tempo. Following this, we have block chords that accompany the cello and voice from the animando at bar 9. At bar 50, we have what's called a tutti, where all the instruments switch to fortissimo at the same time. At the beginning of Bread and Hill, we have those same sustained chords to imitate bells. In the next section, we have what's called melody-dominated homophony, as the voice enters over the top of sustained chords, allowing more freedom in the vocals. This is very common amongst voice melody music, especially in musicals. And following in bar 52, we have our free vocals, a triplet ostinato, and the sustained bells, causing what's called a 3-layered texture.
The bells would ring to call her in the valleys miles away.
Now we move on to the tonality and harmony. Much of the harmony is constant, as can be heard in the first chord of the piece, which is an E-flat major in its first inversion. Any sense of that E-flat major tonality is immediately gated by the A-flat minor in the middle of the bar, with its suggestion of a whole tone progression from E-flat to C-flat in the piano left hand and violin 2. We also have parallel chords feature from bar 1, which is a typical impressionist feature. There is also what's called a false relation in bar 3 between the D flat and the cello and the D natural and the following quaver in the second violin. It's a form of chromatic contradiction that happens across multiple voices within close proximity of each other. Now, to outline the modal character, we have this G appears as the bass with the fourth C instead of a third. This whole ostinato only uses G, C, D and the occasional F, and the final note A of the scale isn't seen until bar 7. Now in bar 11 we have an instance of dissonance where this A flat clashes with the G and the rest of the harmony. Because of the reference to the gales in the lyrics, this is another example of word painting, because the dissonance is in relation to the sound of a strong wind. We also have chromatic downward chordal movement that can be heard in bars 14 to 15. At the beginning of Is My Team Ploughing, we also have some Dorian harmony, with these D minor and G major chords right next to each other. The G chord has the distinctive raised sixth of the Dorian scale, with the B appearing in G major as its third. Now, right from the beginning of Bread and Hill, we can see what's called seventh chords. At the beginning, there's a series of long-held minor sevenths, all of which being in root position. These seventh chords become 11th chords at bar 52, starting with this C minor 11. These extended chords are very common in Impressionist harmony. Starting from bar 29, we also have some more seventh chords, but this time they are in their second inversion. Now we move on to the structure of the pieces. Now the structures are set around the original verses from the poetry that they're from. Starting with number 1, On Wenlock Edge, has 5 verses in the original text. The overall structure is an A section with a repeated A section, a contrasting B section, a repeated B section, and then a combination of both A and B. The A section starts with an instrumental introduction with the voice, followed by the pentatonic ostinato accompaniment, and finally with the gale dissonance with a chromatic melody down into the verse. The following A section is just a modified repeat, but the instrumental introduction now starts in the middle of the bar. The B section features new music for the introduction, has extended trills for the accompaniment, a chromatic phrase that highlights heaving hill, and agitated music to highlight the hurtful thoughts. This is then followed by a modified repeat of the third verse music. The A-B section combines elements of music from both the first and third verses. We also hear the vocal melody from the beginning of verse 1 in the left hand of the piano. We also then have new tremolo accompaniment with the A flats entering at the beginning of the bar, and we end with the sliding chromatic harmonies in the middle verses. Williams actually omits the third and fourth verses in Is My Team Ploughing, and the structure is a modified strophic of A-B, A-B, and then A1, B1. The conversation between two young men is contained in separate verses of the poem. The odd-numbered verses have the words of the ghost, and the even-numbered have the response of the living man. The music of the dead man is marked as misterioso and pianissimo and is to be sung from a distance. After a brief chromatic link in the accompaniment, the living man's response is agitated and has loud repeated triplet chords on the piano with a counter melody on the cello. The second A-B pairing is very similar, with the
second verse same as the first.
The last section is similar, except the dead man's music is now higher with an agitated accompaniment. The response rises to a powerful climax on A flat and rises to a final climax on the top A, as the living man announces that he's taken the dead man's girls for his own, where there's a sudden hush as the final line comes. Then we move on to Bread and Hill, which has a 7-verse structure, which consists of an A, B, B1, C, D, A1, and what's called a postlude. Vaughan Williams uses the word bells as a starting point for the setting. There is a long pianissimo introduction with slow tolling 7th chords. The tenor has a simple diatonic melody in the mixolydia mode with its distinctive major quality, recalling happier times, and there is a change of harmony to flat chords for the last line. In the next section, it's a repeat of the music for the first verse, which means that it's the
second verse same as the first.
The bells now peal out more strongly on the unaccompanied piano, with an ostinato with the right-hand triplet chords based on 4ths and 5ths over 7th chords in the left hand. The following section is very similar, with the music continuing without a break over a similar but quieter ostinato of bell phrases. In the C section, the strings return and the music becomes quieter still, as his love's death is described. There is more dissonance in the string introduction, which clashes with the piano left hand, and the mournful phrases are conjunct. The D section then features the tolling bell in single isolated notes, with the combination of pizzicato violin and arco violin. The minor third interval becomes more prominent, and there is a harsh dissonance between the D notes sounding against the E flat. The final modified A section features high-pitched harmonics on the strings, new accompaniment figures can be heard, and the music rises to a climax on the top A as he begs for the bells to be silent, and finishes with an instrumental postlude that remembers the slow bell music from the beginning of the song. And that pretty much covers everything. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope this served some form of use to you in your A-level music studies. If this is received quite well, I'll probably do another one based on one of the other set pieces. But until then, thank you very much, and enjoy listening to Vaughan Williams.